Welcome to the Kind Leader Podcast, where empathy meets action in the world of leadership. Your host, Gino Degregori, engages with innovators and seasoned professionals from diverse sectors, all demonstrating the power of leading with kindness. And now, your host, Gino Degregori.
Welcome to the Kind Leader Podcast. I'm your host, Gino Degregori. Today's episode is all about leading high-achieving teams, fostering honest communication, and driving sustainable business growth, especially in times of change. Our guest, Steven Gaffney, is a global recognized expert on change management, communication, and team performance. He's worked with top leaders from Fortune 500 companies like Amazon, Marriott, Allstate, and government organizations, including the U.S. military. He's got a book that we'll talk a little bit about, Unconditional Power. Talks about the mood and the mindset here. We'll expand, but he's also a published author on many other books, which we'll maybe talk a little bit here as well. Why this conversation matters. In an era of constant change, leaders need tools to communicate clearly, foster trust, and build resilient, high-performing teams. Steven's approach blends honesty, practical systems, and emotional safety to help leaders drive achievement and growth. Welcome, Steven. To kick us off, can you share about your background and what inspired you to focus your career on helping leaders unlock honesty, communication, and high-performing teams?
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And you actually just gave a great kind of synopsis of my bio, but just to kind of punctuate certain points, a lot of the business started from honest communication. And when I know we're going to get into it, but let me just give everybody kind of a way to frame this. When I talk about being an expert in honest communication, I'm not talking about truth or lies. And I'm not down the path of, oh, everybody's lying. It's not really that. The biggest problem is not what people say, it's what they don't say. And you can call those lies of withholding. Some people have a reaction to that. But whatever it is, we feel often lied to, or at least lacking trust when somebody who's not getting their unsaid said. So the business started with a 9-step strategy on how to have an honest conversation that produces results with anyone. And then from there, it built into working with teams and organizations to create that culture around honest communication. And then it turned into high achieving teams. And we could talk about that versus high performing teams. So I've worked with a lot of the major organizations like Amazon, Marriott, Lockheed Martin, things like that, but also working direct with the federal government, even the U.S. Marines. All of this stuff is very, very important because it's all around getting the unsaid said and creating high achieving teams, which we could talk about.
Beautiful. Congratulations on all your success there. Super excited to dive into the conversation. So the first question I ask our guests is, what does being a kind leader mean to you?
It's a good question in today's work world because kindness, which may surprise you when I say this, is really getting the unsaid said. What I mean by that is so often somebody will say, well, I didn't want to share this because I didn't want to hurt their feelings. But I don't know if you've ever been on the receiving end of somebody who doesn't share something and they go, well, Gino, I didn't want to hurt your feelings. My comeback when somebody says that is, I'd rather you hurt my feelings and tell me the truth than not. So really, caring is sharing. And so unfortunately, it's a word that people often in my work world use as an excuse why they sometimes are not getting their unsaid said, honest communication, pushing on people. But I actually think it's really critical to producing results. And here's something else I found out. Poor achievers, poor performers, poor achievers often receive poor feedback. I've worked with people, they had no clue, and suddenly, their boss does something with their job or whatever, and they're like, I had no idea. And I've worked with the bosses and do a lot with executives, and they'll say, well, I have had that conversation, but when they retell me what they actually said, it isn't really as upfront as they need to be, which I can give some examples. So I would frame the whole kindness as really sharing and getting the unsaid said.
Interesting. That's a great perspective. I never thought about that. It's because, in many situations and the culture, right, based on leadership that sets a tone in an organization is you want to give the feedback, right? But the feeling as humans, right, we don't want to hurt others, right? And that's very true in many organizations. But to your point is like, if you don't truly share that perspective, and you can say it in a very respectful way, you don't have to be mean about it. But if you don't share those things, people cannot get better. People will not understand the situation. And then all of a sudden they get blindsided that they get laid off or they get fired or whatever, right? So it's not kind. I like what you said, sharing is caring.
And plus, and I've also worked with executives. Their job is to produce results, which sometimes are tough conversations and saying to folks, look, we need to change and move. And it's not about popularity. It's about doing things that needs to get done. And they'll say, well, all the ones that are successful tend to be more impatient and very upfront. The ones that are not as successful tend to be way too patient and not always upfront. And so our job is to lead a company, lead organizations, and produce results, because if we don't make sure that results get produced, then we do have to do layoffs. We have to do those things. So our job, if we're really doing our job as leaders, it is really getting that unsaid said and driving for results and shifting the company or the organization as need be to make sure that all that happens.
Beautiful. Do you have an example, like for our audience here, on a situation that you may have talked to for your customers that can highlight that, and how can we navigate through those conversations?
Many, many examples. So I'll give you one as an example, and something kind of that people may not think about. So I work with a lot of executives, but that includes C-level and all with directors of business lines, but even lawyers. And so I was working with a client of mine who he is in charge of all the lawyers for the company. And there was a lawyer who was not producing the results that needed to happen, and actually kind of causing a lot of drama. Mm-hmm. So I talked to him about having that conversation, and he was very hesitant to having that conversation because, of the potential backlash. So I guided him through a process of how to have an upfront conversation and actually basically say to the person, look, this is what the job is. This is what the job is not. And I want to know whether you want this job. And as a result, it turned out that the person didn't want to do that job. They made the move. And here's what I found very interesting about this situation, as well as all the other situations when somebody makes a personnel move. The following two things always happen. The first is they say, I shouldn't have given that person as long a time as I did. In other words, I should have moved much more quickly. The second thing they always say is it's worse than I thought. Because when we remove somebody or move them into a different part of the organization or find a job that's better suited, whatever, we make that personnel move. It's like lifting up a rock and you see all the other problems that we just didn't see. And why is that the case? Because other people who are trying to do a good job are just going to try to work with the dynamics. So when they make that personnel move, you tend to see, and people tend to be very upfront with what was really going on. So I always say this because when somebody's, should I make a move or should I not? By the time you're thinking that, you're probably already too late. So move out and move out quickly. So I say this to the lawyer because you think lawyers will know legal stuff and they're going to be direct and stuff. Still a challenge, let alone many executives who are hesitant to making a move. And they, I have to really coach them to do that. So I see this time and time again. But here's something else interesting. People think, oh, I bet you executives had this handled as a whole. Right. Well, not only with this past example, can I tell you, but here's what I noticed is the higher up you go, the less likely people have an upfront conversation. And the reason is because the stakes are so much higher, right? So it's a problem that's prevalent in most organizations about getting that unsaid said and really doing what we need to do to have those conversations and produce results.
That's great. Thank you for that example. And it resonates. I lead an IT organization here, a lot of great folks. And what I've seen is if you're not clear on the direction and the vision of the company, where it's going, people are not going to know and rally behind that, right? Number one. And number two is when you create an environment where people are not able to feel safe about speaking up, like I have my leaders and I say, hey, I need this, this, and that. And then I need them to be like, I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to do the best at it, but I can't do this unless I have this or I have that. And I've seen that situation because if they don't speak up, then as a leader, I'm already at a loss, right? If I'm expecting this individual to execute on all cylinders, but it's not comfortable or able to do the other thing, that's a disservice to the organization. So how do you create that environment where people can feel comfortable being able, without any repercussion or any backlash or anything that, like, yes, boss, I like this idea, but, I am able to do this, but I need this or that. You see what I'm trying to say here?
Yeah. So it's a great point. So the critical element, and there are many elements, but the critical one, the linchpin, is to create emotional safety.
Mm.
which you're actually addressing. And I'm using that terminology versus psychological safety, which is the most prevalent terminology out there. I actually disagree with that. I've been in the trenches with employees for almost 30 years. And the number one thing that gets people to speak the truth, there are many other things, but the number one is to create that emotional safety. In other words, psychologically, I can feel like it's safe to bring it up, right? Nothing bad's going to happen. Probably I'm not going to get fired. It's not going to hurt me. But it's not cognitively, whether psychologically, whether somebody brings it up or not. It's really they have to feel safe, because human beings make decisions on emotions and they actually justify with logic, which we can talk about. But it's really critical that people actually move based on emotions. And how we know this to be the case is, on another way to look at it is, have you ever presented an argument to somebody and you've given all the factual data, and the data shows we clearly need to move in a different direction, and the person still doesn't move? And the reason is because emotions make people move. Logic sustains the movement. So great speakers, great leaders have to connect with people emotionally. So now back to the getting the unsaid said. People have to feel safe to bring it up. And if they feel safe, then they're more likely to bring it up. And a good example of when that's not happening is a kind of in a comical way. Have you ever had somebody say to you, listen, Gino, you can tell me anything. I love honesty.
Yeah, right.
Please. And so you give them honest feedback, and it might be some criticism, and then they get mad and they react, and you're like, oh, I'm not going to go there anymore. I bet you there are people in your life, and I always say this when I'm talking to teams and people, and even big speeches, I bet you there's people in your life who have trained and conditioned you to lie to them. Because you're like, oh, I don't go there. And everybody tends to laugh, because we all have those types of people. They say I love honesty. But when you give it to them, they don't really like it. So
I can relate to that 100%. I don't mind kind of confessing a little bit. We recently had like a feedback surveys, and I was like, they were anonymous, so we were receiving it, and I said, hey, please be as honest as possible, brutal as possible. Just let us know so we can get better. And there was one that came in, and it was highlighting some things that I personally could improve, that were calling me out. And my initial, as a human, right, initial reaction is like, what? No way. It's like, what is he or she talking about? Like, that's not what I do. And the emotion comes out like automatically. And it wasn't like a mad, but it's more like, oh, I cannot believe this person, But the reality is, as I contemplated and self-reflect and put myself in their shoes from their perspective, right? Because I always look at it from my perspective. And then I was like, you know what? I could improve that for sure. That's something that I can be better at, right? But it takes that, because another leader would be like, forget it. This person doesn't know what they're talking about. I'm going to continue to be me. But that's not how you get better. That's not how you improve your organization.
Yeah. And so people say, what do you do when you feel like you're reacting to it? And my thought about this is, first of all, people are smart and we're lousy actors and actresses. In other words, they can kind of tell. So if you're starting to react and it's showing in your face, we can try to pretend that it's not there. But a better response would be, listen, as you're telling me this, it's hurting my feelings, but I'm glad you're telling me this, because I actually see this is an area I need to look at. So I appreciate it. So obviously, if we don't react, that would be great. But if we feel like we're reacting and it's kind of bubbling out in ways we wish it wouldn't, just kind of own up to it. But own up to it that they're not making us upset. We're making ourselves upset based out on how we're hearing it. And say to them, I really appreciate you saying it. Because here's the thing, it's really tough to give feedback. It really is. People say, I don't understand why they didn't share it, because it's hard.
Yeah.
Most people who are kind don't instinctively want to hurt somebody's feelings. They're worried about the reaction. And so that's why I often laugh when somebody goes, well, I didn't want to share because I didn't really want to bother them. I'm like, no, you just didn't want to go through the uncomfortableness of sharing that. But something else I want to tie in before I forget is we did a national study on teams, and there's different levels of getting the unsaid said, but we found out almost half of all employees in organizations, almost half, live in this shutdown level where they don't share anything or only reactively getting the unsaid said. And what that means is that they'll share, but only when asked. If nobody asks them, they don't share the issues and they don't share their ideas. That's almost half of the employees in an organization. So this is a very prevalent problem that we need to address.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why, I mean, you're giving me a different perspective, Steven. I really enjoy that because, I'm always thinking, I guess, from a psychological perspective, not so much from the emotional. Man, I understand the emotional, but it's always, well, if I make it safe, if I'm talking to them constantly every other week and stuff like that, people should be able to share. But the reality is, like you said, it's hard, right? It's really hard for someone to truly put themselves out there.
Yeah.
So how do you change that? How do you go in an organization? Because you're changing the culture, right? Essentially,
Right.
right? And it's got to have to come up from the top, right? And letting them know that, I'm vulnerable, maybe. I don't know. What do you think about vulnerability? Is that one area that you really advise your leaders to kind of push down the organization to share? Or what is it?
You're actually touching on one of the 5 that I wanted to cover. There are many strategies about how to get the unsaid said. One we covered, right? Emotional safety. The second one is about vulnerability. And that really is important. And this is the way I frame it with people. As a leader, if you're leading any organization, a small team, a large organization, whatever it is, I always say to people, when you walk in, you're intimidating. You're not intimidating to yourself, and you're thinking, oh, it's not intimidating. But by the position, people will sometimes defer and shut down. Sometimes it has nothing to do with us. So the way to counteract that is to show that we're not perfect in how we mess up. Now, it doesn't mean you want to leave people on a down note, but you have to share with people vulnerability. It's interesting how people keep things, and I always say to people, leaders of all levels suffer greatly. I'll give you an example. I was having dinner with a client of mine some years back, and he led an organization about 10,000 people. And we were talking about the organization. He's a really great leader. And he just shared how his son is battling drug abuse. And he said to me, I lead all these people, and I can't seem to lead my son.
Oh, man. Yeah.
That humility just, it just was a bonding conversation. And, we talked about things he could do and moving forward. But so often I see leaders are afraid to share their vulnerability. And I don't mean leaving people on a down note, but show that we're human, or at least say, you know what, I made that mistake too, and this is what I learned out of it. I could share with you tons of mistakes I've made. I did an interview, a national interview, and I screwed up so badly, but I thought it was good. I went back to the office, and my assistant, I said, how'd I do? And she said, do you really want me to tell you the truth? Which is never a good sign when somebody opens that, because you always know.
Right,
Anyway,
right.
Point is vulnerability. Vulnerability, incidentally, is a sign of strength. It's not a sign of weakness. People who are not vulnerable, they're incredibly insecure. My experience of leaders who are very vulnerable is they're actually very secure and comfortable in their own skin. The ones who never share really are deeply insecure. So if you're having a hard time sharing, probably look at some insecurities. Now, we all have insecurities, but in a good place. Vulnerability is critical. As I often say, vulnerability inspires honesty. So be vulnerable.
Right. That's a great point to make. Then you got to balance it out, right? You have to be strategic about it as well. Yeah. You got to read the room too, and where you can share some of those things. But that is critical. And I believe in the previous types of leadership, and I think vulnerability is part of this kind leadership thing for me as well, right? You have to have that, because if you can't be vulnerable, first of all, to yourself, like to create that self-reflection of who you are, right? And then share it with your group, you're not going to grow. Those are the opportunities where you're able to share and kind of, I want to say, diffuse or bring down the barriers in a way, right? We're humans. Like, you really bring it down to the real person, like right now.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important topic to explore, because you're bringing up something else. I've seen other people that are so vulnerable, they just dump on the other person, and it's now like you just have to deal with it. That's not fair either. So I say the lens to look at is what I call why vulnerability, or you could look at it strategic vulnerability, is, in other words, why are we sharing that, and where are we going to leave the other person? So, for example, it's a world of difference to saying, hey, this is what's going on for me, and and you just have to deal with it. I just want you to know. That's not really what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is, here's what's going on for me, and I'm struggling with this, and if you can help me with this, or this is what I'm going to do to fix it. In other words, coming back out towards solutions, that's critical. Or if it's a story, sharing the vulnerability, but then making sure the ending is good, or leaving people inspired, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's an important subject, because I've also seen people abuse vulnerability, where they're just dumping on the person, and then it's the answer, well, I am being vulnerable, and they They just don't appreciate it. Well, yeah, but it's kind of dumping on the other person. It's like,
Yeah.
what's the person supposed to do with that, right?
Yeah. It's almost like, you have employees bringing you problems rather than problems and a solution, right? You're
Yeah,
like, what am I supposed to do with this? And you're right. It's not
exactly.
fair to the other receiving end. It's like, okay, well, I feel for you, but how does this relate to the situation we're in, or how can I work with you to make sure that we can attack X, Y, and Z through this?
And I can give you another example, kind of a way to frame it or a way to look at it is I was coaching the CEO and the company was having some challenges and he was very vulnerable and let all the employees know what was going on. And it didn't go well. And he said, what did I do wrong? And I said, well, here's what you did wrong. It was good that you're vulnerable about the problems, but you didn't lead people out of what we're going to do about it. You didn't
Yeah.
kind of say, all right, so as a result, we're going to do this, this, and this. It was more of just kind of a state of the union type thing, state
Yeah.
of the company. So it is important how we leave people.
Yeah.
I often say to people, the most important part of a conversation is not the beginning, but the end. It's how do
Mm.
we leave people? The most important part of a meeting is not the beginning of the meeting, it's in the end of the meeting. How do we
Right.
leave people? Because lasting impressions are impressions people never forget.
Beautiful. I agree. Perfect. So those the second, right, out of the five things to talk about. You said emotional and then vulnerability, and then
Vulnerability.
what's your
Third is asking direct, open-ended questions. Asking direct, open-ended questions. So prime the pump. And here's what I mean by that. So often I've experienced with working with salespeople, but also executives and leaders, and even people at all levels are afraid to ask the question. Let me give you an example. I was doing a session in Philadelphia, and this lady came up to me and she shared about a struggle she was having at work. And I said, well, do you think you're doing the job that your boss wants you to do? Your manager. And she actually started to get upset. And I said, where's the upset coming from? And of course, the upset was she was afraid to ask him because she was
Mhm.
afraid of the answer. And my response was, when's a good time to find that out? If we're having a problem and not aligning with our boss, when's a good time to find that out? If we're worried we're kind of on the edge of something happening, why not ask? If we're afraid a customer is going to leave us, why not find out how we are exactly doing? If we are looking to gain business, why not ask the potential client, how are we doing on this? But
Mhm.
unfortunately, people ask kind of loaded questions. Like it might go like this: I'm doing a good job, aren't I? Well, that's not really
Mm.
what I'm talking about. How about this? On a scale from 1 to 10, 10 is I'm doing the best job ever for you. 1 is I'm doing the worst job. Where would you place me on a scale from 1 to 10? And then when they give you that rating, then say, what would it take to make it a 10? Or I could even say, what would it take to make it a 15? And when they say, well, that's not even part of the rating,
Yeah.
your response could be, I want it to be the best ever out of the box. What would make this tremendous?
Mhm.
So saying that and framing up questions is really critical. So, however you do it, direct, open ended questions. If we're afraid to ask a question, that's probably the exact question we need to ask.
Mm. Interesting. I like that. I like that you provide that visual as well. Instead of saying, I'm good, right? And now you're like, hey, from 1 to 10, and you describe that, it gives them almost a safety
Yeah.
of hey, you're giving me the measuring stick, and I'm going to answer based on that. Compared to like I have nothing to measure with, and you just want some raw answers based on nobody's going to give you that, right? So I really like that's a great perspective.
And the other thing is how we frame it up. See, unfortunately, we live in a world where people are often afraid to give feedback, sometimes for legal reasons and all that. And I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a
Yeah.
HR professional. So this is based on years of guidance. You just want people to say, look, this is an off the record conversation. I'm trying to just get
Yeah.
feedback. And so, because if they feel like you're going to hold them accountable and it's all this, that's why exit interviews are not that effective because there's
Mm.
a strong incentive to lie. People don't want to burn bridges. So
Yeah.
it takes a way to set it up. And people might say, well, I'm not sure they're going to answer me truthfully. And my response is, well, why not ask? You'll
Yeah.
never know if you don't ask.
Yeah.
So
That's
go ahead
right.
and ask. It's not going to hurt you. Somebody's not going to say, on a scale from 1 to 10, this, and the other person go, I never thought about it. Now you're fired. I mean, it's not going to happen that way. They're
Right. Right.
usually very appreciative of that question. So especially if they say, oh, you're an 8 or 9, and you're like, I'm kind of suspicious. That's a great time to say, well, what would it take to make it a 15? Because I want to do an outstanding job for you.
Right. That's beautiful. You're giving me some great ideas too to talk to some folks here. What's the fourth item there?
So the first one, and they're not in descending order. These are just
Okay.
options. So
Yeah.
vulnerability, emotional safety, asking questions. A fourth one is rewarding honesty.
Mm,
And it's not thank you for sharing, right?
yeah. Right.
People do that. And I'm like, well, that didn't really move the needle. But we have to do something with that feedback. I do a lot of flying, and one of my, where I have a lot of miles is United Airlines. And unfortunately, I think United Airlines might want to consider changing their slogan. At United, we just don't care. And the reason why I say that is I've given feedback and I've never seen even a response to the feedback. So I kind of kid around and say that, but there's other companies as well, and we've all encountered them, where they ask, how about this? They ask for surveys and we don't fill it out. Why? Because it means nothing. But this is how it's relevant in organizations. I've seen organizations do employee surveys and take 6 or 8 months to even get the information back, let alone show employees what we specifically have done with that feedback. So now back to the 1 through 10 question. If the person gives us feedback, we need to reward that feedback by not just saying thanks for sharing, but then doing something with that feedback. And people might say, well, I may not do everything with all the feedback. Okay, well, maybe not everything, but at least show that you're doing something. So rewarding honesty, doing something with feedback is critical.
Yeah. And that's great. Yeah. And I've experienced it recently as I was giving you my example of the feedback that we got. So I was able to take that, sleep on it, and change certain things that I was doing as well as other things in there. So it's critical. I agree 100% because the worst thing you want is you get feedback and then nothing happens. Right. And we've done that in the past too, where, it's like, hey, I provided feedback about this. And if people don't see change, they're not even going to bother providing more feedback in the future. And they're like, it doesn't matter. So that's great.
And something else on that, the way to frame up listening and getting feedback is this is not only beneficial to you or to me or to us, but it's actually much better news, or let's put it this way, it's better news than if there's nothing you could do. Here's what I mean by that. The more I realize that whatever's happening in my life, I'm causing the matter, blaming the matter, whatever word we want. But in other words, there's things that I should have done better. That's actually good news because it puts me in control. But a lot of people blame, and what they don't realize that when they blame others, they've lost control. So great leaders blame themselves first. Poor leaders blame others first. The point is that if we're going to be a leader, and we lead our boss, we lead laterally, we lead our families, if we're going to be great leaders in the world, it's to, whatever problem is happening, look at ourselves first and look at all the things we could do differently and focus on that.
100% agree with that. And I cannot remember which books mentioned this, but I always use this. It's like something happens, you got to look at the mirror rather than the window. I think it was maybe Stephen Covey. I don't know. But it's, I always use that because like what happened, what did I do incorrectly, or what do I need to learn from the situation that just happened first before I start pointing anything out the window, right? Because it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, it's, especially if you're in a situation where you're the buck stops at you. It's like you did it. If you didn't do it, you allowed it to do it, right? So how do you change that in the future?
Can I give you an example? There's many examples that have happened in my life, but is it all right? I want to give some people say, well, he's saying this, so how has he used this? Well, there's many, but one of my favorite ones to give because it was so brutal what happened to me, but it's also was life-changing, career-changing. Here's what I mean. So about a year or two into me giving speeches, I was starting, honest communication, whatever. And I was on an early roll. And so I did a breakout session, and I was so bad that half the people got up and left. Gino, they didn't wait for me to turn my back to go to a flip chart or something. They just got up and left.
Oh, man.
I was humiliated and embarrassed. So here's the interesting point about this. When I got back, I started to ask my peers, what did I do wrong? And some of my peers are like, well, audiences differ and it just happens. Yeah. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to accept that as an answer. The reason is because it doesn't give me any control over the situation. I'm like, what did I do wrong? So I talked to some people and I dissected what happened, and I realized I didn't know how to manage group dynamics. I'd never really studied that. So as a result, I realized that's what I did wrong. And I studied it, and I became really good at managing group dynamics. And then the next session I did and sessions after that were light years ahead of where I would have been.
Nice.
Point is, in life, stuff happens. I'm a cancer survivor, so I had cancer. I'm not faulting the cancer, but I am faulting how I respond. What am I going to do about it? And I kind of looked at my business and retooled it there. I went through a recession. And then, this back in 2009, and things were hitting the skids along with the cancer. And still, I said, what am I going to do about it? Whatever is out there, I really look at internally, because I'm always about, what am I going to do about this?
Absolutely.
We want to put ourselves in control of whatever the feedback we're given.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well said there, Steven. And I agree 100% on that. And you talked about earlier about mindset. It's a shift in the mindset of kind of almost like not only a growth mindset, but also like, you're looking at challenges and situations, right, that are not happening your way as like, is the world happening, the universe happening to you, or is happening for you also, right? The mindset that I've been talking about that forever. And it took me a while. I've always been, after the pandemic, there's a lot of challenges I went through, both personally and, with the business, right? But every time something happens, it's hard to see it during the storm. It really is hard, right? Because it's like stormy and rainy. You're like, you're never going to get out of here. But once that passes, and it will pass, it's the reflection. Okay, why is this happening to me? And what do I need to learn so I can then, avoid it in the future or just learn from it, right? It just helps you grow as an individual, right? And that's resonating with what you're saying. And it's to our audience, it's like, it really is a mindset. If you can continue to look at this world, this journey, you're living this journey in this world essentially, right? So make the best out of it. If the challenges are there, they're supposed to be there. You just need to, learn from.
And so the book that came out about a year and a half ago, Unconditional Power, it's all about being in a good mood. And when we're in a good mood, we're smarter. And there are various strategies in there. But one of the strategies, which we're actually touching on, is about how we look at something and how we frame it up. And so if we change the frame, we change the way we look at something, which enables us to take various different action. So a really great reframe whenever there's a problem is, all problems create opportunities. All problems do. There always has been. Whenever there's a problem, there's an opportunity. I'm not saying all problems are a good thing, right? Or, glass half empty. I'm not doing that. I'm not trying to do motivational speaking on people. I'm actually saying all problems create an opportunity. Recessions have actually created new businesses. There's a way to look at things. When I went through cancer, I mean, it is what it is. I'm fully recovered. But what that was an opportunity to hit reboot on my life and redo some things and relook at some things and take different course of action. I used to live in the future, and then I'm much more present and various other things. I used to not really consider health being an issue, and now I realize it's a big issue. And so, I mean, there's many things, but the point is all problems create opportunities. So what people can do is, when they're faced with a problem, say to themselves, what's the opportunity in here? And am I focused on the problem, or I'm focused on the opportunity? So right now, there's a lot of uncertainty in the markets and things like that. And so I've said to my clients, you have to shift the focus of your organization to focus on the opportunities that are there. Not whatever the problems are, but what's the opportunity? So it's always, what are the opportunities, not focusing on the problem. It's about the opportunities.
I love it. I mean, great talk. I mean, you and I can talk for hours, man, Steven. And I loved all of the little nuggets that you've been providing to our audience. But want to kind of start closing us up here. One thing that I want to ask you is, we talked about mindset, we talked about your books and the different. I think we might have missed one, like a fifth one, if I'm not mistaken, right? We talked about all four. What was the fifth one?
I can go through that real quick, and then people can contact us and I can explain it, because there's other strategies, but I want to hit these five. The fifth one is share what the other person is thinking. So that often will provoke a dialogue. So an example might be somebody who's sitting there quietly, and you've asked them questions, you're trying to do all this stuff, and they're not responding. What you can do is say, look, I imagine you might be thinking this or that. Try to get the difficult message out for them, and that usually will prompt them to do one of two directions. Either they'll say, yeah, that's exactly what I've been thinking, or they'll go, no, I'm not thinking this, I'm thinking that. In fact, I want people to try it out tonight. Ask whoever's in your life, what would you like for dinner? And if they go, well, I don't know, just say, well, I imagine you might want American food or Asian food or Indian food. You just start guessing what they're thinking, and people will not sit there quietly. They will react. So if you
Yeah,
got
yeah.
anybody who's quiet in your life, you just say, listen, I imagine you have something to say, but you don't want to tell me. I imagine you're wondering how you can word this. I imagine it's great. I imagine whatever. You just start saying what you think they're thinking, and it almost always provokes them to speak their truth.
Interesting. Okay. I will use it tonight. Ask my wife some questions there. So thanks for sharing. All right. So what do you think with the shift, with all the uncertainties happening, and what do you see the future of leadership? I feel like I want to make sure that we are empowering and helping our, recently graduates as well as people looking to transition and everything. How do you see leadership changing in the next 5 years?
Well, what I see is the most important skill now and moving forward is create that emotional safety. And here's my rationale as why it's more important than vision and any other leadership trait. It's actually creating that culture of emotional safety and proactively getting the unsaid said. Here's why. If I'm a leader and I'm messing up and I create that safety around me, people are going to tell me, hey, Steven, you're messing up. If my vision is not clear and I create that emotional safety, people say, I'm confused. If there's an operational issue that I need to know about, a customer issue, people are going to tell me if I create that emotional safety. But if I don't create that emotional safety, as a leader, I have to get all those decisions correctly because no one's going to tell me when I'm messing up. So you can focus on all these other traits, but I think the one defining skill of success as a leader, or the key to success as a leader, is creating that emotional safety.
Okay, got it. Emotional safety. Love it. Appreciate that, sharing it. All right, I'm going to have a few rapid fire questions for you. All right. What's one book every leader should read?
I love Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard. And what I love about that book, it's written many, many years ago, but it's all about how everyday people can produce great results in the organization. I mean, I'd love for people to read my books, but aside from that, and not be too self-promoting, I don't mean it that way. Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard. I love that book.
Beautiful. What's your go-to leadership mantra?
Be honest.
I love it. Always. One small actionable step leaders can take today to improve team communication.
Take somebody who's not performing well, have the upfront conversation, and either have them perform or achieve or not. So I think that's one. I want to give a couple others. Appreciate people. For some reason, people are stingy with their appreciation. I've actually talked to leaders who go, well, I don't want people to have a big head. And my response is, how's that working for you?
Yeah.
There's nobody ever left an organization because they were appreciated too much. Yeah, can't stand it. Got to get out of here. People are too appreciative. So appreciation, and the other thing is just making sure that we get that unsaid said. Just make sure that we're getting our unsaid said as a whole.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I'm always grateful for everything people do around. All right, if you could have coffee with anyone alive or from the past, who would it be and why?
My grandfather, because my grandfather died in 1999 and he lived till 99, 3/4 in a day. But now being, an older, much older adult, there's so many questions I would like to ask him. And the reason is my grandfather came over to this country at 40 years of age. He didn't know a word of English and he had to provide for his family because he had to get them out of Italy because of Italian Jews on them. And so what he did was incredible, along with my grandmother. So there's so many questions I now have, like, how did you persevere? Where is it scary? All those things I never really asked when I was younger because it just didn't occur to me. But now, I mean, to me, my grandfather and my grandmother, and, obviously my parents and stuff like that, but my parents, thankfully, are still alive. But my grandmother and grandfather, especially my grandfather, I would wish I could have coffee with him now.
Amazing. I'm sure he has some great stories there. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work?
So if they go to our website, justbehonest.com, and they cite that they listen to your show, we will send them the very first book I ever wrote called Just Be Honest. And the book Just Be Honest has a critical distinction on how to have an upfront conversation with anyone. How do you do it? There's a critical strategy, and I'll send it to them for free. It'll be the electronic version, but they do have to cite that they listen to your show. So they go to justbehonest.com. The other thing is there's an honest calculator and team calculator. There's other things on the site, and there's a bunch of videos and whatever for more learning. But if they go to justbehonest.com.
I appreciate that. Definitely will include that in the show notes and promote it. Any final message you'd like to leave with our audience today?
Big thing is get your unsaid said. You do it and make sure you get others do it and have a great life. All kinds of problems can get solved by just getting the unsaid said.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Steven. I appreciate this. Has been an incredible conversation. Thank you for sharing your wisdom and insights, amazing topics and discussions and nuggets, right, that I think we're leaving behind for the audience. And to our audience, thank you for listening to the podcast. And, the best way to keep expanding and sharing the word out there, just share it with friends, families, or others, right, and continue to listen. So with that, I'll leave you with be kind, bring value, rise together. Have an amazing day, everybody.